This is a video record of our trip to Paris from July 30th to August 4th, 2014. This is part 4. In this part, we visit the Palace of Versailles and the Gardens of Luxembourg. Our breakfast in the hotel on the morning of August 3rd was rushed because we were going to Versailles Palace that day, and the palace was 16 miles southwest of Paris, which meant a train ride, and this in turn meant more travel time. As luck would have it, on this Sunday the subway to the train station was closed, so we had to take the subway to the d'Orsay Museum, then a bus to the train station. We arrived at the Versailles train station about an hour and a half later than we planned. Although we didn't know it at the time, this delay would threaten our plans that evening to visit the Eiffel Tower. Undaunted, we walked the 4 blocks to the palace, which is visible at the far end of this street. As we approached the palace, notice the statue just to the right of center of this picture. This is a statue of Louis XIV, the French king who built Versailles Palace. Versailles became the winter palace of the French royalty until the French Revolution. The line to get into the palace was ginormous. We had been told that we could use our Paris museum passes to bypass the lines at Versailles. After finding out that they did not accept our passes, we grudgingly walked to the end of the line and fumed. We waited in line and in the scorching sun for an hour and a half. This plus the delay in getting to Versailles robbed us of a total of 3 hours that day. Although we did not know it at the time, those 3 hours would later come back to haunt us. Once inside the courtyard, we saw 2 lines. The longer line was for people who wanted to get audio tour headphones. The shorter line was for people who just wanted to walk in. Due to the 2 delays getting to Versailles, we decided on the shorter line. The following are the highlights of the rooms we saw in Versailles in the order we saw them. The first room was the Royal Chapel. This was where the king took communion, where they held ceremonies of the Order of the Holy Spirit, and where they did baptisms and weddings of the prince and princesses of the realm. Here is a view of the Royal Chapel looking up to the ceiling. Next was the kiosk of the Royal Chapel. This also had a small gift shop. After that, we saw the Hercules room. The ceiling art was created using the maroflage technique. That is, scenes were painted on canvas, which was then stuck onto the ceiling. This process took 4 years for this room. The Hall of Plenty was so named because it used to house the royal crown jewels. The Venus room was so named because Venus is depicted in the center of the ceiling art. The Diana room was named after Diana, the goddess of the hunt, and hunting was one of the favorite pastimes of the royal family. The Mars room was used as a guard room, which is appropriate since Mars was the god of war. In the center of the ceiling is a painting of Mars on a chariot pulled by wolves. Hall of Mirrors is the most famous room in the Versailles Palace. It was the site of the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, which ended the First World War. To truly get an appreciation of this room, one needs to remove all the people. This is a picture taken during the signing of the peace treaty in 1918. Here is a picture of the king's bed taken in the king's chamber. Not to be outdone, here are 3 pictures taken in the queen's chamber. This is the coronation room where they crowned Napoleon. This event is portrayed in this painting by Jacques-Louis David. In the painting, Napoleon is standing in the center holding the crown. His wife Josephine is kneeling in front of him. The painting implies that Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France. And finally, here is the Gallery of Battles, which depicts in paintings nearly 15 centuries of French military victories. After we finished touring the palace, we walked outside to see the palace gardens, which included a magnificent fountain and a lake. As we walked further away from the palace, they started playing 16th and 17th century music over the loudspeakers. We continued walking down the path toward the fountain and the lake. The fountain was in the middle of a huge pond. We knew that they only turned on the fountain on Sundays, so we got a good vantage point at the edge of the pond and waited. The fountain depicts Apollo, the sun god, rising from the water in his chariot as he begins his daily flight above the earth. After seeing the fountain, we walked down to the lake. The lake was very popular and even offered rowboat rentals. At this point, we knew it was time to start the trek back to the hotel, so we turned around and started back up the path toward the palace. We were surprised to hear that the music was still being played near the palace. Even though we were pressed for time, we tried to catch a few of the sights we had missed on the walk down to the lake. . 」 「 As we were leaving the palace grounds, Robin heard a mother ask these two French soldiers if they could hold her daughter while she took their picture. They agreed, and Robin snuck a picture of the event. We rode the train back to the same train station from which we had left earlier in the day. The train station is called Les Invalides because it is near the Les Invalides French Military Museum shown here. As a bit of history, Napoleon is buried under the gold dome of the museum. The train station is a stone's throw from Pont Alexander. We walked to the bridge so Robin could get some pictures from the bridge. Here are a couple of those pictures. We took the subway back to the hotel to take a short rest stop. Later, we took the subway to an area of Paris called Sorbonne because we heard it had the most quaint restaurants. Here is the restaurant we chose. It had an easily understandable menu and it served things we knew we would like. It was also Robin's first opportunity to have some French onion soup. She loved it. The main course was great too. After dinner, we walked around the neighborhood, enjoyed some crepes, and did a little bit of shopping. By now it was early evening and we still hadn't packed for the trip home in the morning, so we jumped on the subway and returned to the hotel. As we were packing, it soon became apparent that the delays we experienced earlier that day, along with the time needed to finish packing, would necessitate canceling the reservation I had made for us to go to the top of the Eiffel Tower at 10:30 that night. Robin and I were both heartsick about having to do that, but we had no choice. Our last morning in Paris was gray and somber. The cloud formations from our hotel window were quite odd and mirrored our sadness about having to leave Paris. Our flight did not leave until 2 o'clock that afternoon, so we had our last breakfast in the hotel. Then we went looking for the Luxembourg Palace, which we knew was close to our hotel. After a few wrong turns, we finally found it. The palace is not open to the public, but we had heard that the gardens were magnificent. This was the last photo we took in Paris. After this, we walked back to our hotel and waited for the limo and driver I had reserved. We arrived at the airport in time to do a little shopping. Then at 1:45 we boarded our Iceland airplane and settled into our seats. The trip home started with a 3-hour flight from Paris to Reykjavik, Iceland. We made landfall at about 3:30 in the afternoon near a little Icelandic town called Grindavik. As we came in for our landing, Robin took this picture of the Icelandic landscape. If you look carefully, you can see a little white dot on the road below. The dot is a car. This is the Iceland version of a traffic jam. As you can see, the Reykjavik airport is in the middle of nowhere. The airport is very nice and relatively new, but increases in passenger numbers have already surpassed the waiting area spaces, which made finding a place to sit almost impossible. After a 1-hour layover, we took off for the second phase of our flight. It is interesting to note that the Icelanders have painted many of their buildings bright colors to offset the almost constant gloom of cloud cover. The second phase of the trip took us from Reykjavik to New York. En route to New York, we were served dinner with real silverware and a tablecloth. During dinner, we flew near Greenland, where Robin got this photo of a glacier forcing its way into the Atlantic Ocean. We arrived in New York about 7 o'clock that evening and transferred to this Hampton Inn, which was almost in the path of incoming flights. We could see the New York skyline from our room, which, while not fancy, was very comfortable. The next day, August 5th, we started our last leg home. The flight home was going to be in 2 parts. We would first fly from New York to Charlotte, North Carolina, where we would change planes and then fly on to LA. We had booked our flights on United Airlines, but because United had just merged with US Airways, they told us that both legs of this phase of our trip would be on US Airways. As it turns out, this change would result in the only problems we would experience in the 8 flights it took to make this trip. Just after we boarded the plane, we experienced the first of 2 major foul-ups on the flight home. It seems there was a problem with the plane's electrical system. Fixing the problem took over 2 hours. Worse than that, they would not let us off the plane while they worked on it. 2 hours behind schedule, we finally took off. The flight path gave Robin a great view of downtown Manhattan. We had booked first-class seats for both legs of the trip home and were looking forward to some relaxing flight time. We landed in Charlotte, and since we knew the terminal very well, having stopped there several times before, we used our hour-and-a-half layover quite effectively. Robin particularly likes 2 things in the airport: the rocking chairs and a Brighton store, which she always visits. When we arrived at the boarding gate, we were told that Robin's reservation showed a coach seat, not a first-class seat. After a long argument, we realized that making them fix their mistake was useless. Being a real gentleman, I gave Robin my first-class seat and I sat in the coach seat. After what seemed like an eternity, the plane finally took off without any further complications. This is a shot Robin took of me from her seat in first class. Or was it my seat? At least I got a window seat. During the flight home, we flew through the most beautiful cloud formations I had ever seen from an airplane. As we reached the outskirts of LA, we flew near Big Bear Lake. The visibility when we arrived over central Los Angeles was the best we had ever seen from the air. In the distance is downtown LA. And here it is in close-up. In this view you can see the Harbor Freeway in the center of the picture and the San Fernando Valley visible on the other side of the mountains on the left of the picture. So this is the end of the 5th and final video of our trip to Paris in 2014.